I never imagined I'd step into my own backyard and find a man midair, knees tucked, arms flailing, about to cannonball straight into my koi pond. But there he was, some sweaty guy in neon swim trunks, grinning like he was the king of the world. The second he hit the water, it exploded everywhere, soaking my patio, my plants, and worst of all, me. I stood there, drenched, clutching a tray of iced tea I'd planned to enjoy peacefully by the pond. But peace had clearly been evicted. Two kids with inflatable flamingo tubes splashed around like they owned the place. A family had set up a full-blown barbecue near my shed, smoke curling into the sky as burgers sizzled. Off to the side, a teenager blasted music from a Bluetooth speaker, the bass thudding through my skull. My once serene oasis, my personal slice of tranquility, had turned into a chaotic public pool overnight. And standing right in the middle of it all, sipping something pink through a ridiculous bendy straw, was the one person I least wanted to see. Karen. She lounged in my deck chair like she was queen of the HOA, her manicured fingers tapping lazily against the side of her drink. She gave me that smug, infuriating smile, the one that always meant trouble, then called out over the chaos, "Lovely day for a swim, isn't it?" I was too stunned to speak. 2 weeks ago, my backyard had been mine, untouched, peaceful, a sanctuary. A koi-filled pond nestled among carefully tended plants, visited by frogs, birds, and even a duck named Webster, who had become a regular. My morning started with coffee beside the water, my evenings ended with the gentle croak of frogs and the rustling of reeds. And then Karen happened. It started small, an early morning knock on my door, a clipboard in her hand, that ever-present smug smile stretched across her face. She claimed my pond violated some obscure HOA regulation about unsightly landscaping, pointing out that the algae near the rocks looked swampy. I told her the pond had been there for years, thriving with wildlife, and was fully compliant with HOA guidelines. She waved me off, muttering something about neighborhood standards. I figured that was the end of it. I was wrong. A few days later, I found Karen and 2 HOA members standing in my backyard. Uninvited. Inspecting my pond like crime scene investigators. When I confronted them, Karen gave me that self-satisfied smirk and declared they were reviewing public space conditions. Public space. My backyard. I argued that this was private property, but she just shook her head, feigning pity. Since my pond touched the edge of the community walking path, she explained, it now qualified as a community water feature. Before I could even get a word in, she whipped out a laminated sign, pre-made, like she'd been planning this for weeks, and nailed it onto my fence. Community pond, open for public use. I protested, but she cut me off, claiming the HOA had already voted on it. I hadn't been notified. Apparently, I should attend meetings more often. The next morning, my fence was gone. And now, as I stood there, drenched and seething, watching strangers stomp through my flower beds and treat my pond like a public pool, one thing became crystal clear. Karen had declared war. And I was about to fight back. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the chaos in my head. The splashing, the shouting, the way Karen had smirked like she'd won. My koi fish were huddled in a corner of the pond, avoiding the constant commotion. The plants I had carefully cultivated were already trampled, and trash, empty soda cans, candy wrappers, floated near the rocks. I clenched my jaw, rage bubbling inside me. Karen had taken everything, my peace, my privacy, even Webster. But if she thought I was going to roll over and accept it, she was dead wrong. I grabbed my phone, did a quick search, and smiled. If Karen wanted a community pond, I was about to give her one. The next morning, I made a trip to a farm supply store just outside town. As I loaded up my truck with crates of frogs, dozens of them, I felt a satisfaction I hadn't felt in days. The store owner gave me a curious look but didn't ask questions. I didn't offer answers. When I got home, I waited until nightfall. The last thing I needed was some nosy neighbor reporting me to Karen before the fun began. Under the cover of darkness, I carried the crates to the pond, pried them open, and released my new allies into the water. They leapt out instantly, their slimy bodies vanishing into the reeds, onto the rocks, into the depths. Some perched on lily pads like tiny, croaking sentinels. Others wasted no time diving into the pond, their rhythmic splashes blending into the sound of the wind. By the time I was finished, the pond was alive with movement. A chorus of croaks rose into the night air, a sound I was sure would carry straight to Karen's window. I leaned against the fence, listening. The next morning, the scream started early. A shriek pierced the air, followed by a chorus of panicked yells. I walked outside, coffee in hand, and took in the glorious disaster unfolding before me. The neighborhood kids who had treated my yard like their personal water park were now frozen at the pond's edge, staring in horror. Their inflatable flamingos bobbed in the water, now occupied by dozens of frogs. One kid tried stepping in, only to fling himself backward with a blood-curdling scream as a frog landed on his arm. Another floated helplessly in his inner tube, too afraid to move as frogs leapt onto his lap. Parents rushed forward, dragging their shrieking children out of the water. The Bluetooth speaker kid was now holding his speaker above his head, desperately trying to keep it away from the creatures hopping toward him. A woman let out a high-pitched squeal as she spotted a frog perched on her cooler. And then came Karen. She stormed onto my deck, her silk robe barely tied, her hair a mess like she'd just rolled out of bed. Her eyes darted between the pond, the screaming children, and me. I sipped my coffee, savoring the moment. "What did you do?" she shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at the water. I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" She gestured wildly. "The frogs. Where did all these disgusting things come from?" I took another sip, letting the moment linger before answering. Nature has a funny way of balancing ecosystems, don't you think? Frogs are great for pest control. You should be thanking me. Her face twisted in rage, but before she could respond, a frog leapt onto her deck chair. She yelped, stumbling backward so fast she nearly tripped over her own feet. I bit back a laugh. It was beautiful. Unfortunately, Karen wasn't the type to back down. By the next morning, I woke up to the sound of shovels and heavy boots crunching on gravel. I rushed outside to find a team of workers in my backyard. They had hoses, scrubbing brushes, and industrial-grade cleaning supplies. One of them was already scooping up frogs in a net, dumping them into a plastic bin like garbage. Another was spraying something along the pond's edge. And there, standing in the middle of it all, clipboard in hand, was Karen. She turned when she saw me, flashing that triumphant, insufferable smirk. "Good morning, Mason. No need to thank me, the HOA has generously covered the cost of a full pond cleaning. It's become a bit of a health hazard, don't you think?" My hands curled into fists. "You can't just come onto my property and start removing wildlife." Karen waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, relax. I called animal control. They'll find those things a nice swamp to live in." She turned to a worker. "Make sure to scrub every rock. We can't have any more frog infestations." I watched in helpless fury as the workers continued, trampling over my plants, dumping chemicals into the water, ripping my hard work apart under the guise of cleaning. My koi fish, already stressed from the last few days, were now frantically darting to the far end of the pond. The frogs, the very creatures I had introduced to reclaim my space, were being stuffed into bins and carted away. And just when I thought it couldn't get worse, Karen pulled a crisp white envelope from her clipboard and handed it to me. I unfolded it, my stomach twisting as I read the words printed in bold at the top. HOA Community Water Feature Maintenance Fee, due immediately. My eyes skimmed down to the insulting total. Karen had billed me hundreds of dollars for the cleanup she had forced on me. When I looked up, she was already walking away, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Maybe next time, Mason, you'll think twice before making a mess." As the workers continued gutting my pond, I stood there, shaking with rage, the paper crumpling in my fist. Karen had just made her biggest mistake. She thought this was over. She had no idea what was coming next. That night, as I sat on my deck, staring at the hollowed-out shell of what used to be my peaceful retreat, my rage only grew. My koi fish were huddled at the far end of the pond, clearly distressed. The water, once teeming with life, now smelled faintly of chemicals. The frogs, my secret weapon, were gone, carted away like unwanted trash. And to top it off, I had a bill for a forced cleaning that I never approved. Karen thought she'd won. She thought she had crushed my resistance, wiped away the last traces of my defiance. She had no idea what was coming. I grabbed my phone and made a call. The next morning, I drove to a wildlife rescue organization just outside the city. When I arrived, I explained my situation, minus the HOA war details. The woman at the counter raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. She just led me to a large pen filled with waddling, quacking birds of all sizes. 15 ducks. Some small and excitable, others big and lazy. All of them loud. By that evening, I had carefully unloaded them into the pond, watching as they flapped their wings, explored the water, and loudly announced their arrival. One particularly bold duck immediately waddled up to my porch and let out a deafening quack, as if staking its claim. I grinned. I couldn't wait for Karen to see this. The next afternoon, right on schedule, Karen arrived, clipboard in hand. This time, she was dressed in her HOA polo, looking every bit like the self-important tyrant she was. She stepped onto my deck, already prepared to gloat about how clean the pond looked, until she saw them. Her entire body froze. Ducks. Everywhere. They were swimming across the pond, waddling on the grass, flapping their wings. One was perched right on her favorite deck chair. Another strutted right up to her designer sandals, tilted its head, and squawked. Karen stumbled back with a disgusted shriek. I sipped my coffee, barely suppressing a smirk. "Something wrong, Karen?" She spun toward me, eyes blazing. "What the hell is this?" I gestured casually. "Nature." Her mouth opened and closed like a malfunctioning ventriloquist dummy. "You can't just dump a flock of filthy birds into the pond." I shrugged. "Actually, ducks are fantastic for maintaining aquatic ecosystems. They help control algae and eat pests. You're always talking about neighborhood beautification, right?" I figured I'd embrace the ecosystem. Karen's expression twisted, her eye twitching. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice shaking with fury. She stormed off, nearly tripping over another duck that had wandered too close to her path. I could hear her muttering threats under her breath. I leaned back in my chair, watching the ducks glide across the water. Karen might have cleaned out the frogs, but now she had 15 loud, territorial, and very stubborn replacements. I had won this round. Or so I thought. The next morning, I woke to the sound of sirens. Bleary-eyed, I stumbled to my front door and pulled it open, only to find animal control officers standing on my porch. One of them flipped open a clipboard. "We received a report about an unregulated waterfowl infestation." I didn't need to ask who made the complaint. I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm. Ducks aren't an infestation. They're part of the ecosystem. The officer adjusted his sunglasses. "Sir, the complaint states that the ducks are aggressive, loud, and encroaching on shared community space." I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. "Karen wrote that, didn't she?" The officer cleared his throat but didn't deny it. I knew how Karen operated. She had called animal control once before, to get rid of Webster. I wasn't about to let her win this time. These ducks were legally rehomed from a wildlife rescue, I said firmly. They're not abandoned, they're not a nuisance, and this pond? It's private property. The officer glanced toward the pond, where a cluster of ducks were happily floating, completely unbothered. One of them let out a long, lazy quack. After a long pause, he exhaled. Look, sir, as long as you're not illegally feeding or breeding them, you're within your rights. I crossed my arms. Then there's no problem. He hesitated, then finally gave me a nod. No problem. Karen was watching from her porch, arms crossed, face red with frustration. I turned, making sure she saw my grin. The second the officers left, she was on me. I'll take this to the HOA board, she spat. I'll find a way to get those disgusting birds removed. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the moment. Good luck with that. She spun on her heel and stormed off, her fury nearly vibrating off her skin. I knew she wouldn't stop. Karen wasn't just trying to win anymore. She was trying to destroy me. And if I wanted to keep my pond, and my sanity, it was time to hit her where it hurt. I just needed to wait for the right moment. And that moment would be her precious HOA barbecue. By the time the weekend rolled around, I knew Karen was planning something big. She had been quieter than usual, too quiet. That alone was a bad sign. But when I stepped outside Saturday morning and saw her standing near the pond, barking orders at a group of HOA volunteers as they set up folding tables and decorations, I realized exactly what she was up to. The annual HOA barbecue. She had turned my backyard into the official venue. I took a slow breath, fists clenched at my sides. The audacity was almost impressive. Almost. Karen spotted me and plastered on her signature condescending smile. Oh, Mason. Didn't you get the notice? The neighborhood voted to host the barbecue here. Isn't that wonderful? No. No, it was not wonderful. There were coolers being dragged in. Rows of chairs were being lined up right next to my pond. Someone was setting up a giant drink station while another person laid out plates of food. Worst of all, there was a sign by the entrance to my yard. Welcome to the HOA community pond. I gritted my teeth so hard my jaw ached. Karen didn't just want to control my backyard. She wanted to make it the HOA's centerpiece, the crowning jewel of her reign. I could have argued, could have demanded they pack up and leave, but I knew Karen. I knew the HOA. If I made a scene, she'd spin it into me being an aggressive homeowner refusing to participate in community events. No. If Karen wanted a barbecue, she was going to get a barbecue. And she was never going to forget it. By noon, my yard was packed with people. HOA members, families, kids running around with plates of food. The smell of burgers and hot dogs filled the air. The Bluetooth speaker kid had returned with an even louder sound system, and Karen? Karen was soaking in the moment. She strutted around in her ridiculous HOA polo like she was hosting a gala for royalty. She shook hands, laughed, pointed proudly to the pond as if she had built it herself. I let her enjoy it. Because I knew what was coming next. I had noticed something the week before, after Karen's forced pond cleaning. Right before they scrubbed everything down, I had spotted clusters of frog eggs tucked beneath the reeds. And today? Today, those eggs hatched. The first tiny froglet made its grand entrance by leaping directly onto some unsuspecting guy's paper plate. He yelped, tossing his burger into the air. A woman nearby gasped as another frog hopped into her drink. Then came the screams. One kid shrieked as froglets bounced onto picnic tables, into bowls of potato salad, onto laps and shoulders. A woman stood frozen, eyes wide with horror as 3 tiny frogs clung to her purse strap. And then, chaos. Chairs toppled. Someone knocked over an entire bowl of chips. People ran in every direction, ducking and flailing as froglets rained from seemingly nowhere. The ducks, startled by the commotion, panicked. And when ducks panic, they get loud. Flapping wings, honking, waddling through the crowd, chasing the hopping froglets with manic energy. A man tripped over a chair, sending a plate of barbecue ribs flying directly into Karen's pristine HOA polo. She let out an inhuman screech. I stood off to the side, calmly sipping my lemonade. Karen whipped around, her face twisted in fury, ketchup smeared across her shirt. "You think this is funny?" I took a thoughtful sip. "I think it's fantastic." She was livid. Hair frizzed, face red, covered in food, surrounded by screeching children and an uncontrollable army of ducks and frogs. The HOA guests were fleeing. People grabbed their things, muttering about how the pond was clearly not meant for social events. A woman stormed past Karen, huffing, "This was a disaster." And just like that, her grand moment had crumbled. Karen spun on me, eyes wild. "I am calling the HOA board. This was sabotage. You deliberately." I pulled out my phone, cutting her off with a single tap. The screen flickered to life. A video began playing. And suddenly, the crowd stopped running. The footage showed Karen's so-called pond cleaning. HOA workers trespassing in my yard, dumping chemicals into the water, dragging frogs away like trash. Gasps rippled through the remaining guests. I let it play a few more seconds before locking my screen and sliding the phone back into my pocket. "You violated HOA rules," I said, my voice calm, but firm. "You misused community funds, tampered with my private property, and held an unauthorized event on land that isn't yours. I have receipts, emails, and video proof." The murmur of the crowd changed. The shift was instant. A man near the back muttered, "Wait, HOA funds?" Another whispered, "She's been doing this for years." Karen's face drained of color. She knew. She knew she had lost. The HOA board members, some of whom were still brushing off frogs from their clothes, exchanged serious glances. One of them stepped forward. "Karen, we'll need to have a meeting about this." Karen's mouth opened, then shut. Her fingers clenched around her clipboard, knuckles white. I could see it in her eyes, the realization that for the first time, she wasn't in control. She let out a shaky laugh, a weak attempt to regain footing. "He's exaggerating. He's just bitter about the pond. By poisoning my water and kidnapping wildlife?" I shot back. Karen's face contorted, but before she could argue, the board member cut in. "Enough, Karen. We'll be reviewing this at the next meeting." And with that, her power crumbled. She stormed away, knocking over a folding chair in her retreat, furious, humiliated, defeated. I turned back to my pond. The ducks had settled down, happily splashing in the water. The froglets had scattered, their chaotic work complete. And for the first time in weeks, I could breathe. Karen wasn't gone yet. But after tonight, she was closer than ever to losing everything. I woke up the next morning expecting some kind of retaliation from Karen, but even I wasn't prepared for what came next. Sitting in my mailbox was a crisp white envelope, marked with the HOA seal. Inside was an official notice demanding that I pay half the cost of the so-called emergency pond cleaning. My jaw tightened as I skimmed the absurd charges: specialized frog removal services, sanitization of aquatic features, even unlicensed wildlife containment. Karen wasn't just trying to punish me, she was making me pay for my own sabotage. I refused to back down. When I stepped outside later that day, I saw Karen whispering to neighbors in hushed tones, spinning her version of events, no doubt blaming me for the chaos at the barbecue. Then came the emergency HOA meeting, where she stood at the front of the clubhouse, playing the victim. She claimed I had deliberately introduced invasive wildlife and jeopardized the community's safety with my pond. She even went as far as calling it a public health risk. Some neighbors murmured in agreement, but I wasn't worried. I had come prepared. When she finally paused for breath, I pulled out my phone. "I'd like to share some footage," I said, tapping the screen. The clubhouse went silent as clear video evidence of her trespassing, illegally dumping chemicals, and misusing HOA funds played for everyone to see. Faces turned. The murmurs shifted. Someone muttered about misuse of funds. Another whispered, "She's been pulling this for years." And just like that, her power unraveled. The HOA board announced they would investigate her actions, including her illegal use of community money. Karen stormed out, humiliated, but I knew she wasn't done. A week later, a city inspector arrived at my door, clipboard in hand. Karen had filed an environmental complaint, claiming my pond was an unregulated wetland. If the city ruled in her favor, I could be forced to drain it completely. But what she didn't realize was that by bringing in an official inspection, she had set herself up for her biggest failure yet. I did my research. I called the same wildlife rescue that had helped me with the ducks and found out something glorious. Some of the frogs in my pond were actually a protected species. If I could prove it, the city wouldn't be able to touch my pond. The next day, I brought in a wildlife expert who confirmed it. My pond had become a legally protected habitat. Karen had backed herself into a corner. By drawing attention to my pond, she had unknowingly helped me secure legal protection for it. The HOA had no more control. They couldn't turn it into a public pool. They couldn't fine me for maintenance. Karen had lost. At the next HOA meeting, Karen was voted out as president. She was also forced to repay the HOA funds she had stolen for her fake pond cleaning. Her reputation? Shattered. She avoided me after that, walking quickly past my house without making eye contact. A few weeks later, I sat on my deck, watching the ducks paddle peacefully, the koi swim without fear, and Webster, who had miraculously found his way home, perched happily near the water's edge. The frogs croaked, the reeds rustled, and for the first time in what felt like forever, my backyard was mine again. I couldn't resist hanging a new sign on my fence, just for fun. Mason's Pond, wildlife only. Must request entry. I knew Karen would hate it. And honestly, that made it even better. Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below. Let's see who had it worse.